name from a jaunty, jagged song by Brian Eno. A certain ratio wore shorts, looked shocked by life, played a lazily savage white funk, and were managed by Wilson and Gretton, as well as being on the Factory label. Martin Moscrop from A Certain Ratio.
Rob Gretton saw us and really liked us, and he told Tony Wilson about us, so the next stage was Tony Wilson coming to see us at a gig, and he saw us and he really liked us. We reminded him of Mancunian Velvet Underground at the time. He got us on at the Russell Club, which was the Factory Club. We used to play there quite often, supporting acts, and he told us about the label that he was starting, and within 6 months of meeting him, we had a record out on Factory, which was All Night Party, which I think was Factory's second release after the Factory sampler. So things moved pretty quickly once we met Tony, and it was quite a big advantage, really, having the record label boss as your manager as well, because you know, he would make sure that he was pushing the right buttons for us. But as a manager, he was more than your average manager that you get nowadays, because as well as getting us gigs, he used to actually physically get us to the gigs in the back of his, I think he had a Peugeot at the time, estate, and the four of us, because we were four-piece at the time, pile in there. Tony donated his Fender Stratocaster to us and his amplifier, and anything we needed, he'd provide for us. And what you've got to remember is I'm talking about the time here when Factory wasn't famous at all, wasn't well known. But as the label got more and more popular, Alan Erasmus would be our sort of tour manager, because Tony was too busy with the day-to-day running of the label, and obviously also being a presenter at Granada TV, because everyone knew Tony as that guy off the telly through his programme So It Goes in the late 70s. And you've got to imagine, if you think of a picture of Tony at the time, he was quite an unhit character. You know, we're talking about the beginning of the punk era, or 76, 77, 78 here, where everyone had short spiky hair and sort of do-it-yourself outfits, and Tony had long shoulder length hair with a big quiff and flared jeans and cowboy boots. But everyone sort of had respect for him because of the music that he chose for his TV programmes.
Peter Saville.
I never think of Factory as a music story. It's bigger than that. It's about how the kind of, in a way, the sort of nascent voice of a generation defines something about the times and about those people and their aspirations and where they're going. And it's the evolution of society through pop, which I think is really crucial. And Tony has his own point of view, a more political, I have a kind of cultural point of view on it. Tony has a sort of socio-political point of view on it. And he always articulated what these groups were doing within a bigger context. He didn't talk about them in the context of solely music.
Even while still operating as a wild and wacky Granada television personality, Wilson had found an improbable way to demonstrate his love for surprising new music. His sensibility, as defined by a love for Shakespeare, the Sex Pistols, and the psycho-geographical anarchists, the Situationists, would lead to Factory becoming a birthplace for post-punk music. It would also, as the result of a glorious erratic series of accidents, intentions, coincidences and plans, create an ideal of what an independent label could and should be. The Factory Committee had become the founding fathers Wilson and Erasmus, joined by Rob Gretton, Peter Saville and Martin Hannett, the ultimate Northern Boys Club, making up and breaking the rules as they went along. Each had their own particular talent to contribute to the partnership. The inventive spiritual thinking of Erasmus, the mocking, loyalist Manchester passion of Gretton, the audacious design vision of Saville, the perfectionist studio genius of Hannett, and the exuberant, militant, showbiz sensationalism of Wilson, his ability to bring everything together whilst creating a climate of near chaos.
Three of us were the founding partners of Factory. Tony, his close friend Alan Erasmus, and myself. We all were contributing something. And this idea to release a record as a recognition of the club, nothing else, and as an opportunity for 2 or 3 groups who had not yet had a record deal. So we released a record as a springboard for some groups who we thought, if they had something on vinyl, perhaps it can kickstart, their opportunity. There was no intention to form a record company, but we completely naively and innocently formed a thing called a partnership, which is actually quite a handicap. The partnership went from 3 to 4 when Rob Gretton voted to keep New Order with Factory, and then to 5 in recognition of Martin Hannett's work as producer. So there were 5 of us who were partners. Later, when Factory became a limited company, there was a share division amongst those people. The agreement with the groups was exactly the agreement that you would have with some friends over a drink one night. I know, I'll put some money in. If we make anything from this, I'll take my share back and we'll split the difference. And this was the founding principle of Factory, and that continued to be it, particularly for New Order. It worked in some ways. It meant that actually the groups saw a far greater return per record than they would have done with a corporate record company. But they weren't going to sell as many records, and there wasn't going to be investment in them, and there wasn't going to be publicity, and there wouldn't be promotions, and there wouldn't be advertising. But you were free to do what you wanted to do, and the groups chose to make the music that they wanted to make and enter into this kind of chance and see what happened. They knew that if they sold 10,000 records, they'd get half of the proceeds, which is, it's okay. You don't feel that you're being exploited. There wasn't actually any sense of exploitation.
Vinnie Riley had previously been in thug punk group Ed Banger and the Nosebleeds, and wasn't necessarily anticipating that the sleeve to his debut album was not as such going to feature his photograph. Wilson, who clearly resented having to be so practical as a Granada television journalist, got common sense out of his system as a record company boss. He decided that the first Durity Column album would come encased in coarse sandpaper. He stole the idea from the Situationists and loved the fact that such a sleeve would symbolise his contempt for everyday record labels and their everyday sleeves. The return of Durity Column would scratch whatever album it happened to be placed next to. As if to predict much of the fabulous trouble that Factory would eventually cause, the sandpaper sleeve, glued together by Factory helpers including a bemused Joy Division, would buckle.
Tony gave us all this big book, which was the manifesto of the Situationists. I think it was called Leaving the 20th Century, and a guy who I was supposed to co-write songs with but refused to because I didn't get on with him at all in any way. It was called Dave Rowbottom, and it was he decided, he told Tony apparently we should have the sleeve as a sandpaper sleeve because it was in the Situationist manifesto that they would bring out a book with a sandpaper cover which would destroy the covers of all the other books we had. It was actually his idea, I think, and Tony went along with that.
In a way, Factory acts were treated like boy bands, being told how they would sound, what their sleeves would look like, what their image was, what their schedule was. Joy Division, becoming uniquely powerful as a live group, were disappointed by the sound Hannett created in the studio, a seething, fretful and strangely subtle Joy Division sound that came out of Hannett's imagination, not the group's. They heard their debut album, Unknown Pleasures, as fixed and mixed by Martin Hannett, and wondered where their violent stage force had gone. Joy Division never really liked their own albums, even as they changed the sound of rock music.
The story about Martin Hannett is Martin would pull your brain around, he would pull your head around and mess with your brain, basically. I mean, I remember Joy Division were doing a track, and they kept running through this track, the backing track for one of the songs on Closer, and Steve was playing the drums, and it sounded great, and it really did sound good, and Martin kept shaking his head, and then he'd get Steve to hit the bass pedal. This went on for about 2 days, just concentrating on it. It was just so obsessed with the drum sound, and for 2 days they worked on it, and in the end it got to a point where Martin said, no, it's not working. You have to take the drum kit apart completely. Take it all apart, Steve, and put it back together again. And poor Steve is completely losing it. He's going insane by this time. Takes his drum kit apart, puts it back together again, sits at his drum kit, weary, tired, stressed out, angry, everything. And Martin Hannett, He's like got this little smug smile on his face. It's